It began like any other flight. First-class passengers boarding, flight attendants smiling, everything perfectly ordinary, until a young black girl in seat 1A was accused of stealing her own ticket. A white flight attendant called the cops, certain she'd caught a fraud. But when the plane doors opened, and the man who walked in turned out to be her father, the CEO of the airline itself, the cabin fell into stunned silence. This isn't just a story about power. It's about perception, and what happens when prejudice tries to police the skies. If you believe respect should fly first class too, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. It started with a stare. Not a long one. Just that quick, sharp glance people give when they've already decided who you are. The girl in seat 1A noticed at the moment she stepped on board. The way the flight attendant's polite smile flickered, then faded. The way her eyes darted from the ticket to the teenager holding it. Maybe it was the braids. Maybe the sneakers. Or maybe it was just disbelief that someone like her belonged up front. Outside the window, the tarmac glowed gold in the morning sun, streaks of light reflecting across polished wings. Inside, the hum of engines mixed with the muted shuffle of passengers finding their seats. It was a scene of calm efficiency. Business travelers scrolling through tablets, a mother soothing her baby, a soft voice over the intercom. But beneath that calm was something quiet and sharp, a tension that only one person could feel. The attendant leaned over, professional smile back in place, but her tone carried an edge wrapped in courtesy. She asked to see the girl's ticket again. Then the ID. Then the question that carried the weight of 100 similar moments across her young life. Are you sure the seat is yours? The girl's breath caught. She'd heard that tone in stores, at school events, and lobbies. That polite disbelief that turns every right into something to be proven. She nodded softly, hands trembling slightly as she handed over her documents again. The attendant studied them, lips pressed tight before stepping back. But she didn't move on. Not really. Her eyes lingered, watching, measuring, waiting for something to justify her doubt. Passengers began to notice. Whispers moved through the aisle like static. Someone muttered about fake upgrades. Someone else about kids these days. And then the humiliation. The attendant pressed her earpiece and said the words no one expected to hear in first class. I'm calling security. The girl froze. Around her, the air seemed to thicken, every sound distant, every gaze heavy. She wanted to disappear, to meld into the seat, to undo whatever part of herself had made them think she didn't belong. Minutes stretched like hours. The jet bridge door stayed open. Then came the footsteps, firm, deliberate, and the cabin fell silent. When the man in the tailored navy suit stepped through the door, everyone looked up. They didn't know him, not yet, but they could feel the authority before he even spoke. He scanned the scene once, the trembling girl, the pale-faced attendant, the confused officers, and in a calm voice that carried across the cabin, asked one question. What seems to be the problem with my daughter? And just like that, the balance of power shifted, because the man they'd just called down wasn't another angry parent. He was the CEO of the airline they worked for. And what happened next would shake that company, and the world watching online, to its core. The morning had started with quiet excitement, the kind that fills the air before a special trip, when the world feels wide and full of possibility. 12-year-old Alina Washington sat at the kitchen counter, her backpack neatly packed beside her, her passport tucked carefully inside. She was flying with her aunt to visit her grandparents in Boston. It was her first time flying alone in first class, a gift from her father who wanted her to feel safe and comfortable. Her father, Marcus Washington, had left early for meetings. He was the kind of man who carried presence into every room, calm, disciplined, decisive. Few people outside the company knew that Marcus wasn't just another executive. He was the chief executive officer of one of the country's largest airlines, the same airline his daughter would be boarding that morning. To him, that flight represented more than transportation. It was his company's promise of dignity and care, especially for passengers like Alina, those who trusted the wings he built. At the airport, Alina followed her aunt through the sleek corridors. The morning rush buzzed with motion, rolling suitcases, echoing footsteps, voices over the intercom. She held her ticket close, its gold first class, stamp glinting under the overhead lights. Her aunt smiled and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before parting ways. "You'll be fine," she'd said softly. "They'll take good care of you." When Alina stepped into the aircraft, her eyes widened. The first-class cabin gleamed with polished surfaces and soft lighting. Leather seats stretched wide. Large windows poured sunlight across calm faces, and the faint scent of coffee drifted through the air. She moved quietly to her seat near the window and set down her bag, her heart beating fast, a mixture of excitement and pride. The flight attendant greeted her with a practiced smile, but there was a flicker of hesitation. Her name tag read Heather. She looked to be in her mid-30s, with sharp blue eyes that missed little. Her smile didn't quite reach them. Alina noticed, but said nothing. As passengers boarded, Heather's tone with others was cheerful and relaxed. But when she returned to Alina's row, her posture changed, more rigid, more watchful. She asked questions no one else seemed to get. "Are you sure this is your seat? Who are you traveling with? Where is your ticket again?" Alina answered politely each time, her small voice carrying a quiet confidence her father had taught her. Never apologize for your place in the world. Yet each interaction left her shrinking a little more into her seat. Around her, the hum of conversation filled the air. People sipped champagne, scrolled through tablets, laughed softly at morning headlines. No one seemed to notice the shift in tone, the undercurrent of suspicion directed at the little black girl sitting alone in luxury. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Heather's unease grew. She double-checked Alina's boarding pass, then left to speak with another crew member. Their whispers carried faintly through the cabin, glances darting back toward Alina. A man in a tailored suit across the aisle looked over, curious, but returned to his laptop. The rest of first class existed in its usual bubble of comfort and ignorance. Alina tried to distract herself, looking out the window as the plane taxied onto the runway. She thought of her father, how he always told her that flying was like life. You trust the process, even when you're not in control. She smiled faintly, watching the city shrink below the clouds. An hour into the flight, Heather returned. Her tone had softened, but her body language still carried tension. She asked Alina if she wanted something to drink, her words polite, but edged with disbelief, as if serving her didn't feel quite right. When Alina requested orange juice, Heather nodded stiffly and walked away. The drink arrived 5 minutes later, placed carefully on the tray table, untouched by warmth. The man across the aisle noticed again. Something about the interaction seemed off, too formal, too cold. But he turned back to his work, deciding it wasn't his business. Alina took a sip and stared quietly ahead. She could sense it, the invisible wall between her and the people around her. She wasn't being shouted at or insulted. It was something quieter, harder to name. The way Heather's smile faded when looking her way. The double takes from passengers who assumed she'd wandered into the wrong section. The tension that shouldn't exist in a space designed for ease. On the ground, Marcus Washington was in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city. His day was filled with schedules, reports, and discussions about flight safety, customer experience, and company culture. He believed deeply in those values: integrity, inclusion, respect. The airline wasn't just a business to him. It was personal. He'd built his reputation on creating an atmosphere where every passenger, no matter their color or class, felt seen and valued. But even the strongest systems have cracks invisible from above. As the hours passed in the air, the subtle tension began to thicken. Heather approached again, her brows drawn, her tone firmer this time. She asked Alina to confirm her name, then asked to see her boarding pass again, despite already having checked it twice. The girl hesitated, confused. She handed it over once more. Heather inspected it for several long seconds, then disappeared to the galley. When she returned, her expression had hardened. Something about the way she looked at Alina had shifted completely. It wasn't just suspicion now, it was judgment. A belief forming in her mind that this child didn't belong there. That maybe she had somehow taken someone else's seat. Heather leaned slightly, voice low but clipped. "We may need to speak to the captain about this when we land," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. A few glanced over, curious. Alina's face flushed hot. Her hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. The shame wasn't from guilt, but from being singled out, marked, made small. Across the cabin, a few murmurs began. Someone whispered, "What's happening?" Another muttered, "She looks so young." No one intervened. As the plane descended through the clouds toward Boston, Heather's expression carried quiet certainty, the kind that comes when someone thinks they're enforcing order. She radioed the ground crew. Her words were careful, professional, but layered with assumption. "Passenger verification issue," she said. "Possible fraudulent ticket." On the tarmac below, police were already waiting. In the seat by the window, Alina stared out at the skyline. She didn't know yet what awaited her, only that something felt wrong. A storm she hadn't caused but couldn't escape. And miles away, in a quiet office overlooking the same airport, her father's phone began to ring. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt. Passengers stirred awake, stretching, gathering their belongings. The usual shuffle of arrival filled the cabin, seatbelts clicking, overhead bins creaking open, phones lighting up as signals returned. But for Alina, everything felt heavy and strange. She sat perfectly still, clutching the handle of her small backpack, unsure of what she'd done wrong, but sensing that something bad was about to happen. Heather stood near the front of the cabin, talking quietly to another crew member. Her voice was low, but there was purpose in her posture, the kind of posture people have when they think they're doing the right thing. She glanced back at Alina more than once, her eyes narrowing with misplaced certainty. When the seatbelt sign turned off, most passengers rose and stretched, chatting about their weekend plans. The man across the aisle noticed the two uniformed police officers, waiting just beyond the jet bridge. They stood tall, hands resting near their belts, scanning faces as if looking for someone. He frowned slightly, realizing this wasn't routine. Alina looked up just as Heather approached. Her voice was calm but distant, stripped of the courtesy she'd shown others. She told Alina to remain seated until the other passengers exited. The tone wasn't a request. As the aisle cleared, whispers began. A few people glanced over their shoulders. One man muttered something about security checks. Another woman gave a sympathetic look before hurrying off. Within minutes, the cabin emptied, leaving Alina alone in the bright silence of first class. Heather's expression carried a strange confidence, as though her suspicions had been confirmed. She stood near the doorway, waiting. The captain stepped out briefly, glancing toward the officers who had now entered the plane. Heather gestured discreetly toward Alina. The officers walked down the aisle with slow, deliberate steps. Their radios crackled softly. One of them asked Alina to stand and show identification. Her small voice barely carried. She said she didn't understand, that her aunt had dropped her off, that her father had booked the ticket. But the officer's expression remained neutral. They asked her to step out of the seat. Heather stood off to the side, arms crossed, as though justice were being served. She had no idea who she was dealing with, no understanding of the world that would soon crash down around her assumptions. Alina followed quietly, her hands trembling as she held out her passport. The walk down the jet bridge felt endless. At the gate, a small crowd had gathered. Curious employees, airport staff, and travelers watched as the young girl stood, surrounded by uniformed officers and airline crew. Her backpack hung loose on her shoulders. She blinked hard, holding back tears. One officer asked her questions, her name, her age, who bought her ticket, where her guardian was. She answered as best she could. The responses didn't seem to change much. They checked the ticket, then called a number listed on the reservation. Miles away, Marcus Washington was in his office when his assistant rushed in. She looked pale, her voice trembling as she held out her phone. The words she spoke stopped him cold. There had been an incident involving a first-class passenger on one of their flights, a child, and police were involved. He asked for the flight number. When she told him, his stomach dropped. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the elevator. His driver barely had time to catch up as Marcus climbed into the car, his expression unreadable. The ride to the airport was a blur of phone calls, half-heard apologies, and rising fury. At the gate, Alina sat in a corner chair near the boarding podium. Her backpack rested at her feet. Every now and then, Heather glanced her way, speaking to the officers in low tones. The captain had already left, leaving her to handle what she thought was protocol. When Marcus arrived, his presence shifted the entire terminal. He walked with quiet precision, calm but powerful, the kind of calm that draws every eye without a single word. The officers straightened instinctively when they saw him. The gate agent froze mid-sentence. Marcus's gaze fell on his daughter first. She stood and ran to him, her voice breaking as she said his name. He knelt, pulling her close, his hand on the back of her head. For a long moment, the noise of the airport faded. When he rose, his expression had changed completely. The warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by something steely and unyielding. He turned toward the officers, his voice low but commanding. They realized immediately who he was, not just a parent, but the CEO whose signature appeared on every employee's ID badge. Heather's confidence faltered as he approached. She tried to explain, something about procedure, about protocol, about suspicion. The words fell apart as soon as they left her mouth. He listened in silence, the kind that feels heavier than shouting. The officers shifted uncomfortably. They knew now that they'd been called into something that wasn't what it seemed. Marcus asked one simple question, why his daughter had been singled out. No one had an answer that made sense. Heather began to realize the gravity of her mistake. What she had seen as vigilance now looked like bias. What she had convinced herself was professionalism was prejudice dressed in uniform. And the consequences of that prejudice were standing in front of her, not as a reprimand, but as a reckoning. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words cut through the tension like ice. He asked the officers to stand down. He told the gate supervisor to gather the crew. And then he told Heather, very quietly, that he wanted her to explain her decision, not to him, but to the people she had embarrassed, to the passengers who'd watched, and most of all, to his daughter. She couldn't speak. Her throat closed up, her hands trembling at her sides. The passengers from the flight had started to gather near the gate, murmuring among themselves. Some recognized Marcus. Others just sensed that something serious was unfolding. One woman who had been in first class spoke up softly, saying she'd noticed how uncomfortable Heather had seemed around the girl. Another man added that he'd thought it was strange, but hadn't wanted to interfere. Marcus turned toward them and thanked them, not with warmth, but with finality, a quiet acknowledgement that truth was now visible. He looked back at Heather one last time. Her face had drained of color. The badge on her chest suddenly felt heavy. She stammered out a half-hearted apology, her voice barely audible. But Marcus didn't respond. He turned back to his daughter and said they were leaving. As he led her through the crowd, every step echoed louder than words. The police stepped aside. The staff lowered their eyes. And for the first time that day, Heather understood the full weight of what she had done. In the car, Alina sat quietly, still shaken but safe. Marcus looked out the window, his reflection framed by the moving city lights. He wasn't angry in the way most people are when wronged. His anger was colder, more deliberate. He thought about the company he led, about the policies, the training, the promises of equality. He thought about how even in his own house, under his own wings, racism had found its way in. At headquarters, news of the incident had already begun to spread. Reports circulated, calls were made, and within hours, the story reached every corner of the company. Some whispered that the flight attendant would be terminated. Others said it was an overreaction. But none of them had seen what Marcus had. A child humiliated for existing in a space she was told she didn't belong. That night, Marcus sat in his study long after Alina had gone to bed. Her boarding pass lay on the desk beside a photo of her smiling in her school uniform. He traced the edge of the paper with his thumb, thinking of all the faces that had looked away, all the systems that had failed her without ever raising their voices. He knew what had to happen next. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror, one he couldn't ignore. He picked up the phone and called an emergency meeting with the airline's board. What began as a father's fury was about to become something much larger. And somewhere in a small apartment across town, Heather sat alone on her couch, staring at her uniform folded neatly on the table. The badge that once made her proud now felt like evidence of something broken. For the first time, she began to question not just what she'd done, but what she believed. Morning light filtered through the glass walls of the airline's executive tower. The skyline beyond shimmered with calm, but inside, the air was anything but. Marcus Washington stood at the head of the long boardroom table, his reflection caught in the polished surface. Around him, the board members murmured in low tones, faces drawn, voices cautious. They all knew why they'd been called in so suddenly. The video from the airport had begun circulating overnight, shaky phone footage showing police approaching a quiet black girl in first class, an anxious flight attendant in the frame, and a father's arrival that silenced an entire terminal. By sunrise, millions had seen it. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. He began by recounting what had happened, not as a father, but as a leader addressing a wound in his company's soul. Every word carried weight. He spoke about Alina, about the humiliation she'd endured, about the passengers who said nothing and the employee who assumed the worst. And then, without looking down at his notes, he said something that froze the room. "This company is mine," he said, "but yesterday, my daughter learned it didn't protect her." Silence filled the space. No one dared move. He turned toward the window, watching planes lift into the pale sky. We preach diversity. We publish our values. But somewhere between the slogans and the service, humanity got lost. That's not a PR issue. That's a moral failure. He paused, letting the words sink in. What he didn't say was how deeply personal this was, how he'd built this airline from near bankruptcy, how he'd fought to open doors for people of color in aviation, how every uniform, every employee handbook carried his signature. And now, one of those employees had used that uniform to shame his own child. Across town, Heather woke to a phone vibrating on her nightstand. Messages, emails, missed calls. Her name was trending online, her photo circulating alongside words she couldn't bear to read. Racist flight attendant, CEO's daughter incident, corporate hypocrisy. It was everywhere. Her stomach twisted as she scrolled through the comments. Some were angry, others mocking. A few defended her, claiming misunderstanding, but most saw the video for what it was, a clear act of bias. She turned off her phone and sat on the edge of the bed numb. For the first time, she realized how quickly silence can turn to noise, how a single decision can follow you like a shadow. At the same time, Marcus was already in motion. The internal investigation had begun before dawn. HR departments across the country were instructed to review every racial bias complaint filed in the last 5 years. Old cases reopened, patterns examined. What had started as a single moment of prejudice was now unfolding into a full corporate reckoning. By afternoon, media trucks lined the front of the airline's headquarters. Reporters waited for statements. Employees whispered in hallways. Some looked relieved, as if long-ignored injustices were finally being confronted. Others looked scared, uncertain of what accountability might mean when it came knocking at their own doors. Marcus had instructed his communications team to say nothing until he spoke personally. And when he did, it wasn't through press releases or polished language. It was through an unscripted address broadcast to every employee screen across the country. He began with the same steady voice that had once inspired pilots, engineers, and flight attendants alike. But this time, there was no corporate polish, just truth. He told them what happened. He told them about Alina, and about how even a seat in first class couldn't shield her from bias. He spoke of the quiet pain of being judged before being known, of the daily microaggressions people endure under the guise of policy and procedure. He ended with a promise. Not the kind found in mission statements, but one spoken like an oath. He vowed to rebuild the culture from the ground up. to make training real, accountability transparent, and justice more than a word printed on posters. The video went viral within hours. Employees watched with tears in their eyes. Passengers shared it with captions like, "This is leadership." Even critics admitted they hadn't expected a CEO to face something so personal so publicly. But while the world debated, Marcus's focus stayed inward. He wasn't trying to restore reputation. He was trying to restore faith in himself, in his company, in the idea that people could still choose integrity over convenience. For Heather, the days that followed blurred together. The airline suspended her pending investigation, and though no one told her directly, she could feel the end coming. She avoided the news, avoided people, avoided mirrors. But the silence inside her apartment grew unbearable. Eventually, she opened her laptop and began typing an apology. Not to Marcus, not to the company, but to Alina. She wrote about fear, about how she had mistaken vigilance for virtue, about how she had grown up believing certain faces meant danger, certain tones meant defiance. She confessed that she hadn't seen Alina as a child, but as a story she'd already decided she knew. She didn't expect forgiveness. She just needed to face what she'd become. A week later, Marcus received the letter. He read it quietly at his desk alone. The apology was raw, unpolished, the kind of truth that doesn't try to excuse itself. He didn't know if he believed every word, but for the first time, he felt something shift. Not peace, not closure, just the faintest crack of understanding. In the days that followed, he met with advocacy groups, policy reformers, and diversity consultants. The company's culture overhaul became national news. Airlines across the industry began reviewing their own practices. What had started with a single flight attendant's bias was now reshaping an entire sector's conscience. But behind all the headlines, what mattered most to Marcus was the quiet moment at home, when Alina came into his office one evening, holding her favorite stuffed bear. She sat across from him and asked softly if people would stop hating her now. He didn't have an answer. He wanted to say yes, to promise that change was coming fast enough to protect her. But instead, he told her something truer, that sometimes the world changes one story at a time, one person deciding not to look away. She nodded, her small hand reaching across the desk. He took it, and for the first time since that day at the airport, he allowed himself to breathe. The breaking point wasn't the confrontation itself. It wasn't the humiliation or even the media storm that followed. It was this, a father realizing that power means nothing if it doesn't protect the people who need it most. It was a child learning that justice is often slow, but still worth believing in. It was a company rediscovering that its values weren't measured by profits or planes in the sky, but by how it treated the smallest passenger in its care. And it was a woman, once blinded by bias, finally seeing herself clearly for the first time. The breaking point wasn't a single explosion. It was a quiet, steady unraveling, the sound of illusion giving way to truth. By the end of that week, the world had moved on to the next viral outrage. But inside the airline's headquarters, real change was still unfolding, not in headlines, but in policy drafts, training rooms, and uncomfortable conversations where people finally started listening instead of defending. And somewhere deep in that quiet work, a father's anger began to turn into something else, resolve. Because for Marcus Washington, this wasn't just about a flight, or a scandal, or a name on a headline. It was about legacy. It was about ensuring that his daughter, and every child who looked like her, could one day board a plane without wondering if they belonged there. That was the moment the breaking point became something else, the beginning of transformation. Weeks passed. The noise faded, but the echoes lingered. The world had moved on to new stories, new scandals, new distractions. But inside Marcus Washington's home, the lessons still lived quietly between father and daughter. Alina was back in school now, her bright energy returning little by little. Some classmates whispered, others looked at her differently, some with sympathy, some with admiration. Children absorb headlines in strange ways, but Alina carried herself differently too. She had seen something most kids hadn't, the fragile line between dignity and prejudice, and how fast it can disappear. Marcus watched her grow stronger. Each morning when she zipped up her backpack and smiled at him, he saw a light that hadn't been broken, just tested. At work, the storm had reshaped everything. The airline's training programs were rewritten from scratch. Every employee, from flight attendants to executives, went through immersive education designed not to check boxes, but to change perspective. Stories like Alina's became part of that training, not as cautionary tales, but as mirrors. Marcus didn't stand at podiums much anymore. He preferred small rooms now, staff break rooms, hangars, crew lounges, sitting with employees face to face, listening. He realized leadership wasn't just about speeches. It was about proximity. The closer he got to the people who served, the clearer the truth became. Most didn't want to harm. They just hadn't been asked to see. Heather's name faded from headlines, but her absence remained. Her letter to Alina stayed on Marcus's desk, folded, worn, reread many times. He never responded publicly, but one quiet afternoon, he drafted a short message to her through the company's HR system. He wrote, "I received your letter. I hope you mean what you wrote. If you do, use what you've learned." That's how healing starts. He didn't sign it as CEO, just as Marcus. Across the city, Heather saw the message appear in her inbox. She read it again and again, feeling the weight of those simple words. Healing starts. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it offered a direction forward. In time, she began volunteering for an organization that trained service workers on implicit bias and conflict de-escalation. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was something real, something that asked her to look people in the eye and see them differently. For the first time in her adult life, she listened without defending herself. Meanwhile, Marcus kept his focus on the bigger picture. He worked quietly with advocacy groups to develop industry-wide reform. He met with other airline CEOs, urging them to adopt similar measures. Some resisted, claiming cost, time, or public fatigue. But Marcus had learned that change rarely begins with permission. It begins with conviction. His conviction was now unshakable. At home, late at night, he sometimes replayed that day at the airport in his mind. The moment he saw the officers near his daughter, the shock in Heather's eyes when she realized who he was. He didn't relive it out of anger anymore. He relived it as a reminder. Power is only useful when it protects those without it. There was a moment, a few months later, when Alina asked to fly again. She wanted to visit her grandmother on the other side of the country. Marcus hesitated at first. The thought of airplanes still carried a sting, but he saw the determination in her face and knew he couldn't let fear win. They arrived at the airport early that morning. The terminal smelled of coffee and jet fuel, the same as always. But this time, something was different. Employees recognized them, not with awkward glances, but with quiet respect. A few nodded subtly as they passed. When they reached the gate agent smiled and said, "Welcome back, Miss Washington. We've been expecting you." The warmth in her tone wasn't rehearsed. It was human. As Alina settled into her seat, Marcus stood in the aisle for a moment, watching her look out the window. Her small hand traced the edge of the armrest, her eyes wide as the engines began to hum. He felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about trust. The plane lifted, sunlight flooding the cabin, and for the first time in a long while, he closed his eyes and let the moment be what it was, ordinary, safe, whole. Far below, the city stretched like a map of choices. Every building, every street a reminder of the countless small acts that shape how we treat one another. Marcus thought about the people working in his company that day. The attendants greeting passengers, the pilots double-checking controls, the cleaners preparing the next flight. Each of them held the power to make someone feel seen or invisible, valued or dismissed. And that, he realized, was the real heartbeat of leadership. Not policies, but people. When they landed, Alina turned to him with a grin that was pure sunlight. "See," she said softly, "it's just a plane again." And she was right. For the first time since that awful day, it was just a plane. No headlines. No fear. Just a flight. And a little girl who refused to let someone else's ignorance define how she saw the world. Marcus smiled, brushing a tear from his cheek before she could notice. In that small, unremarkable moment, he found everything he'd been fighting for: dignity, peace, and the quiet possibility of a better tomorrow. Back at headquarters, a new plaque hung in the training center lobby. It didn't have his name or his title. It was a quote he'd chosen himself, words that had guided him through the storm. Every passenger is someone's story. Treat them like you'd want your own story told. Employees passed it daily, some barely noticing, others stopping to read. But for those who understood where it came from, it wasn't just a message. It was a reminder that empathy isn't an act, it's a discipline. And for Marcus Washington, it was a promise, one he intended to keep. Because when a single moment of bias can travel faster than any plane, the only thing that can outfly it is compassion. Some stories end in noise, cameras flashing, voices raised, applause or outrage filling the air. But the most important ones, the ones that change something inside you, often end in quiet. This story was one of those. Long after the headlines disappeared and the internet found its next target, the ripple of that single flight continued to move. Through training manuals, through conversations at kitchen tables, through the way people looked at one another when boarding a plane. It reminded everyone of something both simple and forgotten: that dignity is not earned through wealth, appearance, or title. It's a birthright. Alina never asked to be a symbol. She just wanted to sit where her ticket said she belonged. But the truth of her story reached beyond her seat, into a much larger truth about how power and prejudice still live quietly in the systems we trust. Her father, Marcus, had seen racism in many forms, some loud, some polite, some dressed in corporate clothing with smiles that didn't reach the eyes. But that day on the plane showed him something new: how even privilege can fail to protect you when perception becomes stronger than truth. His daughter hadn't faced hostility because of her behavior or her background, but because of what someone assumed she wasn't. That realization stayed with him. It changed how he led, how he listened, how he raised his child. He began speaking less about fairness and more about awareness, because fairness is the goal, but awareness is the path to it. And awareness begins when we stop defending our comfort and start questioning it. Somewhere across the country, Heather was learning that too. Her story didn't end in disgrace, though many wanted it to. It ended in humility, a harder, slower kind of redemption. She attended workshops she once would have dismissed as corporate noise. She heard from people whose pain she once would have doubted, and slowly, her certainty dissolved. It's easy to apologize when everyone is watching. It's harder to change when no one is. But she did. Not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. There was no public reunion, no dramatic handshake, no social media closure. Just a quiet understanding that sometimes the most radical form of justice isn't humiliation, it's transformation. Through it all, Alina kept growing. Her experience became something she carried, not as a wound, but as wisdom. She spoke about it once, during a school assembly about courage. Her voice shook at first, but she kept going, saying that courage isn't about fighting. It's about standing in your truth when the world tries to shrink it. The audience was silent. Teachers, parents, students, all listening. Not because her story was dramatic, but because it was real. Everyone in that room had felt small at some point. Everyone had been misjudged or dismissed. Her story became a mirror, and mirrors make us look closer. That's what stories like this are meant to do. They're not about blame. They're about clarity. They remind us that racism isn't just hatred, it's habit. It hides in moments when we assume instead of ask, when we react instead of reflect, when we decide who belongs before we've even met them. Every person has power in those moments, power to choose patience over suspicion, empathy over ego. The flight where this all began was just one day in one life, but its lessons belong to all of us. Because this isn't just about planes or passengers. It's about how we move through the world, how we choose to see others, and whether we recognize the quiet privileges that shape our assumptions. If you've ever witnessed a moment like this, on a bus, in a store, at work, and felt that sting of injustice in your chest, that's your signal. You're not powerless in those moments. Silence is a choice, and awareness, spoken out loud, is courage in motion. The next time you see someone being dismissed, disrespected, or doubted for something they can't change, pause. Remember this story. Remember how one assumption turned into humiliation, how one father turned that pain into purpose. And then ask yourself, what would you do if you were in that aisle, watching it unfold? Because the truth is, every one of us will be. Maybe not on a plane, but somewhere. At a school, in an office, on a street. Somewhere where bias walks in quietly, wearing normal clothes, waiting for us to notice. And when that moment comes, the measure of who we are won't be in how loudly we speak, but in whether we act from empathy or fear. Marcus learned that power isn't about who you are. It's about how you use it. Heather learned that apology means nothing without evolution. And Alina learned that dignity isn't given, it's carried. Their story isn't perfect, but it's true. And that truth is enough. So if this story moved you, don't just feel it, share it. Not for views or numbers, but because awareness grows when we tell the hard stories. Because the next time something like this happens, and it will, maybe someone who heard this will pause long enough to do the right thing. Maybe that's how change really spreads, not through grand speeches or viral outrage, but through one heart choosing to see another fully. So to whoever you are, listening right now, on your way to work, at home, in traffic, scrolling through stories, remember this. Your awareness is your power. The way you see others shapes the world we live in. If this story made you think, talk about it. If it made you angry, channel that anger into action. And if it made you hopeful, hold on to that hope, because it means you still believe we can do better. That belief is where everything begins. Because until every flight, every classroom, every office, and every street feels safe for every person, this story isn't finished. It keeps flying, from one heart to another. And maybe that's the point. Because stories don't end when we stop telling them. They end when we stop learning from them.